Inclusion Podcast by Enolla Consulting. Well, what a delight. I'm joined today in the studio by Natalie Venturini, also known as Nat, I think. So
yes,
we go for Nat or Natalie for this.
I really don't mind.
Well, you can choose. This is an inclusion
Let's go for
concept.
Nat.
Let's go for Nat. That's right. Interestingly enough, Nat, the whole conversation about names is a big issue, actually, isn't it, in inclusion? Because, isn't it? You can imagine that I've never met you before, and I just decide to contract your name and say, "Hello, Nat."
Oh, how dare you? You don't know me.
That's exactly right. I remember somebody said to me years ago, they had a call from like a salesperson called, and they said to this person, "Hello, Paul. May I call you Paul?" And the guy said to him, and the guy says, "No. If I let you call me Paul, what will my friends call me?" And I thought, that's a very interesting point.
Each to their own.
Each to their own. Well, listen, I know that you're the marketing leader. You manage the marketing piece for Stanton House, don't you? Which, of course, is one of our partner firms, which we're delighted to be able to work with. And the relationship we've had with you over the years has been a real joy to us. So I'm so glad that you're in the studio chatting to us.
Thank you so much for having me today.
You're very welcome. And for those who don't know Stanton House, check them out. They do fantastic work. You're involved in recruitment pieces, executive recruitment in the UK and across North America as well, aren't you?
That's right.
And particularly, you've produced recently a neurodiversity guide, which has been fantastic. So I had a good read of that before and hope I remembered lots of stuff for our interview.
Thank you.
So look, we want to talk about the whole notion of the neurominorities. It's a big subject now, particularly within our inclusion conversation. But you have a particular place in this story, don't you? And one of the things I've noticed now over the years is when I work with clients, and when clients are really lent into a particular subject, we have a concept about the 7 whys, why you're interested in something, and this arc goes from sort of complacency to crisis to compliance to competition to, I don't know, maybe conscientiousness. But then you reach this final person, and that person is there because of a level of consciousness. They are so completely in the space. And whenever I kind of pull back the covers a little bit and find out why is it that you're so invested in this agenda, there's nearly always a personal story attached to it. I think yours is the same, right?
You're absolutely right. I've worked in the recruitment industry for all of my professional career, but neurodiversity and the topic really comes from a personal place. And I have my own personal story to tell as to why it's become such an important topic for me.
Amazing.
So yeah, I'm sure we'll delve in.
Can we jump into that?
We certainly can.
I know you've got, you have a neurodivergent son, right?
Yes,
Leo, isn't it?
That's right.
You've got 2 children, am I right?
You're right.
Aria and Leo. And tell me about Leo.
Yeah, so I'm a mother of 2 children. Aria is 10 years old. Leo is nearly 8 years old.
Bless him.
But by the time Leo was about 2, my husband and I, started to realise that he was actually quite different. He lost the few words that he had started to use, and he soon stopped talking altogether. At night, he would stay awake for hours and hours, banging on walls and doors, and always wanting to get out into the garden to be on his trampoline.
Wow.
He didn't really interact with other people, but particularly other children, and he didn't play with toys. But the one thing that was really kind of stood out to us and got worse over time was his hypersensitivity to sound. So he would have huge meltdowns whenever he heard certain noises. So even me brushing my teeth would set him off.
As sensitised as that?
Yes, absolutely. A dog barking way off in the distance, he would just fall to the ground, and he'd start to bang his head very hard on the ground. And it got to the point that he was actually doing this hundreds of times a day, and his poor little head was very bruised. It had a permanent big bruise on his head. It was incredibly hard to watch, but also to predict and to stop. But he's since been diagnosed with Autism Spectrum Disorder, ASD, as well as Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder and Sensory Processing Disorder, which in his case means he's hypersensitive to both sound and touch. To this day, he doesn't use speech to communicate. He has his own language, really. So he can't tell us if he's sad, he's happy, he's unwell, or if he needs a bowel movement, for example. So we have to be hyper vigilant. And as I say, read his body language a lot more. Leo has lots of wonderful vocalizations, very repetitive, and also very intricate hand gestures that, again, are very repetitive, which is known as stimming. And when Leo's having a good stimming session, he's really happy. We can tell he's really happy. And he doesn't really like to be interrupted in those moments. It's almost like he's visualising something or he's acting something out. So yeah, it's he's got his own language that we've learned to read, really. He avoids most demands that are placed on him, really simple things like getting dressed, going upstairs to bed, having a wash, getting into or out of a car. So I guess, doing the normal things
Sure.
that you and I might take for granted, like going to a shop or having lunch in a restaurant. It's just not possible with Leo. The things that he finds really challenging is transitioning from one environment into another, or any waiting around. If we have to wait for anything, it's game over for us. We have to remove him from that situation, or get home as quickly as possible. We were once stuck in traffic, in a bad traffic jam, and the car was stopping and starting all of the time, and that stopping and starting, caused him to
just agitates and
yeah, he just couldn't cope with it, and he actually smashed the window with his head. But that's an extreme example of how he can't wait for things. He gets so distressed in those moments. So yeah, an extreme example, but nevertheless a good one, I think, to demonstrate
really powerful.
Demonstrate his inability to wait for things. But he. I guess another example in how things manifest in day-to-day life for Leo is his lack of tolerance for clothing. So I mentioned
Is that the sensitivity?
touch. Yes, sensitivity to touch. So he's always taking off his shoes and socks all of the time. He hasn't worn a coat in years. So everything we buy for him is trial and error as to whether he'll accept it or not. And it has to be super soft, super comfy to really even stand a chance. He eats lots of weird and wonderful things, everything from mud, trees, leaves, even sand. But we know he's doing this actually because he's seeking sensory input, and it actually helps regulate the way he is, the way he's being.
Wow.
So we actually leave lots of tissue paper lying around the house that he can tear up, lots of fidget toys. We've got a swing in the house, a little trampoline, basically anything that he can chew, destroy or jump on until his heart's content. So yeah, it's been a learning curve to understand what triggers his anxiety, what triggers destruction around the house. And we've always had to and continue to make adaptations to how we live and to his environment, just to help him cope, really, with the world around him. Thinking about the adaptations that we've made around the house, we're really lucky to have the support of Leo's grandparents. My mum helps us before and after school.
Oh, that's great.
And Leo's granddad is always fixing the last thing that Leo's broken around the house. So Leo attends a special school, our local special school, which is wonderful. So he's surrounded by people that actually really understand him. And, we're in a good place now, I think, compared to where we were a few years ago. He rarely bangs his head at the moment. He's learnt to cope much better with the noises that he doesn't like. And he's smiling a lot more. We're seeing his gentle and affectionate side increasingly. He gives us more eye contact. It can be quite intense at times, his eye contact. And he's also instigating tickle games
Oh, how wonderful.
and coming over and actively giving us cuddles. You do have to have your wits about you, though. That cuddle might end in a swift bite to the neck.
Oh, God.
But yeah, I mean, we're always apprehensive of the future, but we're in a much better place right now.
Well, I'm so thankful to hear you say that. My mind is racing with different questions, and I'm sure that our audience are going to want me to ask some sensible ones to you, but I've got them kind of in this sort of bundle of them in my mind. Well, the first one I've just got to kind of just take a bit of a step back from, because you said, you're in a better place now than you were a few years ago. Immediately what I was thinking to myself was, actually, I met you a few years ago, maybe
right.
4 or 5 years ago, for however long it was. But the thing that really struck me, actually, no, well before the pandemic, wasn't it, that we first met?
It was
Yeah, that's right.
just before the
Just
pandemic.
before, wasn't it? And so one of the things that really strikes me, knowing now what I didn't know then, was how were you able to kind of compartmentalize that? How were you able to? Well, I mean, let me just be honest. I don't want to be clever. I'm just going to be honest. And if it's a stupid question, I just apologize. But how do you function when you're carrying the weight of your concern for Leo? How do you function just
Day by day.
So no, it's a
Honestly,
great answer. Day by day.
It's day by day because, his challenges are kind of different minute to minute, hour to hour. And some phases can last longer than others, some challenging moments in time. He had a period of time where he had terrible stomach issues, and he ended up becoming very constipated. And the only answer in those times was to go to A&E. Imagine going to A&E with a Leo.
Oh, with a child that can't wait, who can't see, who's sensitized, who's noise sensitive.
It was.
How's that going to work?
It doesn't very
No, it's not
well.
gonna
Is
work,
the
is it?
answer. So those times were very, and it lasted about a year, that phase. And he wasn't sleeping at all and would scream most hours of the day because he was in pain. We learnt a lot. I'm lucky. My husband's an absolute rock. I've got the support of a close family around me.
Amazing.
But yeah, it was hard, very hard.
Honestly, I'm just sort of sitting here going, I really don't get that. I don't understand how you were able to, because I experienced you when I worked with you without knowing any of this, just experienced you as this consummate, effortlessly with this kind of effortless effort that you seem to succeed in your work at. And I was just like, what? And you were holding all of that in the background.
Well, first of all, thank you.
No, I'm just sorry. I'm just like, well, okay. I just need to recognize that. I hope that's not patronizing, because to me it was I'm overwhelmed by that, because it's just amazing to me.
I think compartmentalizing is the word there, because that's basically what I
You
did.
bracket things, right? You have to sort of put things in brackets, yeah.
But work was a massive outlet. It was a place of time where my brain could not be consumed by what was happening.
Well, that's such an interesting point. That's such an interesting point. And it actually ties to a very important aspect. I mean, it's kind of tangential to our conversation, but I wouldn't mind bringing it in, because one of the things I'm interested in when I think about inclusion is, for me, the output of inclusion is about belonging. And I think that there was an interesting survey done recently, Ernst & Young did it, and they were talking about the 3 points of belonging. They said the number one place that people experience belonging is in the home, but number 2 is in the workplace, and number 3 is in their community. And what I like about Stanton House, and maybe this is kind of a bit of a haven point really, is that it does seem to me that the organisation worked well to make the place a place where people can belong.
I think so, absolutely.
Yeah, that's powerful.
As a parent of a child with a disability, I've been afforded the flexibility that I need to care for Leo day to day, to attend the endless appointments that I have for him. On any given month, I'm meeting psychiatrists, paediatricians, speech and language therapists, his school, social care. The list goes on, and I'm able to work part-time, but also I only travel into the office 1 day per week, which I'm grateful for and, have and continue to need.
but all credit to Stanton, because I mean, I think to be imaginative, to be flexible, because when we think about inclusion, that we talk about the idea of treating everybody equally well, and what you need to be treated equally well might be different from what Esther needs to be treated equally well, and that is so important. But it's a great lesson for employers, because if you want to retain the best people, you have to wrap around care around those people to make sure that they're not conflicted the whole time, and the fact that that happens with you is amazing. So that was kind of just like a bit of a sort of PS in my mind.
Yeah.
But let me go back to a couple of other things I wanted to talk to you about. One is really a kind of parenting call out, really, and I'll get into the journey with you in a second. Mm-hmm. But you had some fairly obvious signs with Leo that there was, he wasn't going to be the same as other children, in the sense that we're talking about these disabilities. I'm conscious of the fact that when it comes to some of the neurodivergent issues, particularly some of the autistic issues, that sometimes those conditions are, we suspect that there may be something, but we don't necessarily inspect it. We don't necessarily, go through and follow it through. And I can think of a couple of occasions where we've had friends where my wife, who's a therapist, has looked at some friends' children and said, you might have an issue that you want to think about. But there's been real denial about that. The parents go, no, don't be silly, there's nothing wrong. And you go, well, okay. And it's kind of difficult to say to your friends, but it must be difficult to receive. What's your thoughts about that for a parent?
I think as a parent, you envisage your child's path in life to some extent. You, when they're young, you imagine their first steps, their first words. And I think you imagine what they might be doing at different stages of their lives. But as a parent, you kind of have to let that all go when you have a Leo. And as hard as it is to say, you have to learn to live with uncertainty. And you can't plan too much. I know when Leo was first diagnosed, he was about 3.5. We found it really hard to come to terms with. And I described that as at the time, it felt like grief.
Of course.
It was grief for the loss of the normal.
Of course.
That we would never have, and that his sister would never have. But, now... Sorry, I just have to pause for a bit.
No, listen, take your time. This is real talk. And honestly, I'm just indebted for you being prepared to talk to us and our community about it. This is so important. So please just take your time.
Thank you. Let me just gather my thoughts.
No, you take your time.
I think, really what's been key is to learn to understand him. That's what's unlocking his happiness.
Unlocking his happiness is a lovely thing to say, yeah.
Yeah. As much as I still live in hope I might one day hear him use words, for now, what I want to continue doing is to learning more about his motivations and understanding him, because that unlocks his happiness. It unlocks all of our happiness when he's happy. And that, knowledge is power. We've been able to make changes in how we communicate with him, adaptations around the house to his environment. And that is what we are continuing to do. I've never seen pure joy from anyone than I have from Leo when he stumbles across a blackberry bush in the forest. And it's in those small things that we see.
Gorgeous.
We see joy all the time. And any small little achievement that he has, we feel it really profoundly. So in that way, we're really lucky that we have all these small things that happen that bring us all so much joy.
That's incredible. So tell me about, I appreciate you have to let go of certainty, and I think that's a really honest thing to say. That's a really super honest thing to say. But you're obviously, there are worlds that he's living in, right? So he's living in his world at home. So it feels like you obviously have done the adaptations, as you said, to make that work, and continue to do, of course. He goes to school. So he's obviously, I'm interested in the world outside. But you come from the recruitment back business, right? You must be also forward thinking about saying, what is the world outside the home? What is the world outside this school? What does the world, for Leo, the adult, look like? How do you
Yeah,
think
there's
about
so
that?
many different contexts with it. The world of work,
Sure.
accessing the local community, schooling, education, and as a parent, you think about all of it. But you're right, the world of work, particularly because I work
Yeah, of
within the
course.
world of recruitment, has been on my mind. And I think educating employers about neurodiversity, what it means, how you can be more inclusive to those with different conditions, both within the organisation and throughout your hiring process, for example. It's really important because I'm not talking about a small number of people either. It's estimated that 1 in 5 of us have some form of neurodivergence.
As many as 1 in 5.
Yeah, so, an organisation of just 50 people, 10 employees will have some kind of neurodivergence, whether it's dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, the list goes on. So I think it's so important that employers are A, aware, and then B, ready to make any necessary reasonable adjustments that they may need to do to embrace those people.
And that's the interesting phrase you use, because of course what you're doing is you're making any adjustment reasonable or not, as far as Leo's concerned, because Leo's your son, right? So you'll do whatever needs to get done. When you're talking with employers, help me with that a little bit, because the notion of reasonable adjustments is an interesting one, isn't it? So we can forget parental adaptations. That's, we do whatever. What's your thinking about that? How can we help employers who want to be more inclusive? To your point, you've got 20% of the working community are likely to be in neurominorities. So okay, so you might have very high functioning neurominorities, and I'm certainly in you. Tech is part of your space, isn't it? So I'm sure you're seeing a lot of that in tech and the data space and so on. But what can organizations do in order to make the sort of reasonable adjustments? Because they're not just going to be physical adjustments, are they? Some of them are going to be psychological and emotional adjustments. It's not just me saying, oh, well, we'll put in, I don't know, ergonomic chairs, or we'll put in,
Yes.
sound bar, or whatever it might be. But there are other adaptations they need to make
There are
as well.
so many things. And I think the important thing to remember is that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, because what might be a good adjustment for one person might be terrible for another.
This is important. Yeah, this is important.
But talking about the psychological element there, putting things like an end date to an application for a job is really important for someone that gets anxious about change, or anxious about
It's such an
when,
interesting thought. Yeah.
a simple thing like that could make all the difference for someone that gets anxiety around what's going to happen next.
Just having the process stepped out.
Just having
Isn't
the
that
process stepped out, being really
fascinating?
clear with what's going to happen, who you're going to meet at interview, where you're going to meet them, how long it's going to take, and then don't put surprises on that person. Don't change things without plenty of advanced warning or, notice. Things like that I think are really important and really simple to do.
And that's interesting, because and here's a challenge, and you'll know this from your world, right? I always think to myself that the real enemy of inclusion is pace. So when you've got organizations that are running hot, they're running at high speed all the time, then pace seems to me to beget thoughtlessness. And inclusion requires you to be thoughtful, right? So what do I do from an employer's point of view if I'm someone who's at pace, and I like the frenetic stuff, I like the noise, I like the change, I like the spontaneity, I'm all right with the ambiguity, but I like the din, and I'm in an environment where it may not be as progressive as yours, and people aren't necessarily self-identifying.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do in that circumstance?
I think you have to realise that every job needs different skills.
Yeah,
So
that's good.
I think starting from the initial job itself, what are the skills that you need from a person to do well in that job? Don't assume they have to all have great communication skills. If that role isn't customer facing, do they need to have great eye contact? if they're dealing with,
It's a great point. It's a great point.
if they're dealing with lots of data, autistic brains have actually been shown to spot patterns and identify patterns, A, more quickly and B, more accurately than non-autistic brains. So it may well be a great trait to bring into a role such as a data scientist, for example.
Yeah, it's a good point. Actually, and those adjustments are interesting. We were talking to the people that deliver our data solutions for us, and they were saying that they'd done an audit with an organisation, and the head of the organisation, the chief executive, decided that he was going to kind of refit the office where they could have, they kind of bring your dog to work offices and table tennis tables and all this green juice and whatever else it was. Anyway, it turned this fabulous open space, amazing, and they were just about to roll out the proposal, and the team that do the neuroscientific data stuff said, do you want to just talk to the organisation about this change? Anyway, it turned out that nobody wanted an open plan, bring your dog to work office. What they wanted was, they just wanted booths where they could sit in with their headphones and be left alone. And so it was fascinating, because what the employer then did was actually change which was to their credit, they changed the whole proposition. Instead of having this chintzy office, they did something completely different, and it was much more sound sensitive. It was a very interesting thing, and it was difficult for the chief executives. They wanted, the table tennis office.
Yeah, with the bean bags and
you got it right. That's not what their staff needed, and I thought that was quite an interesting lesson. And to your point, it seems to me that certainly one size fits one, doesn't it? So you have to literally be thinking to yourself, okay, what does every individual need? I would love that we felt psychologically safe enough in the workplace to be more open about our neurominorities, or all our social identities, really. Social identity is something I'm obviously very interested in, but the very notion that I'll be able to present and say, look, I have a particular condition, I'm dyspraxic, whatever else it might be. The amounts of people that I can think of just at a kind of very soft end, live with, not soft, and none of these things are soft, but live, for example, their working lives with dyslexia and never told anybody. It's just like,
and
it's incredible.
There's it's very common not to disclose.
This is what I'm saying. This is the thing.
Sadly, there's a lot of discrimination when it comes to judging people on those different things. Not everyone has the understanding of what that condition really is, but also not an understanding of the strengths or the challenges that individual has, and they jump straight to perhaps a prescribed notion of what it means to be autistic, and that's not true of every person. Not every single person is how they picture an autistic person to be. Leo is very different from every other autistic person. He is autistic, but he's not the same as every other autistic person. Every single autistic person presents differently and will have different strengths, abilities, and that's really important to remember, I think.
So now help me a little bit to understand what employers can do in order to just create, perhaps just as simple as creating the level of psychological safety to enable people to say, do you know what, I've got other needs. And I think it's important that we kind of think about this conversation in a slightly different way, because we often talk about special needs, and I understand what special needs means. I completely get that. But I think it's, in the workplace, perhaps more helpful if we start talking about that people have particular needs. So I have a particular need for this, and someone has a particular need for that. Now, Leo will have some very particular needs. But again, anybody who's showing up as a neurominority, or anyone with different, other social identities, will have particular needs. So what can I do, A, to cater for those particular needs, and to also create an environment where people are prepared to surface those without feeling stigmatized as a result?
So particular needs, we all have them. Leo, for example, cannot sit still. He fidgets a lot. I talked about his stimming, and that's a trait that many autistic people have. The need to have that sensory input, or to touch something, to move. So I think making adaptations to that need might be allowing being tolerant of something that's maybe not socially normal to see someone get up and have a little jump.
But you know what? Seriously, that's an interesting thing to say, because I reflect on one of the things that I was constantly told off about when I was a child, was fidgeting. Stop fidgeting. I used to hear that all the time. And if I think about it now, I'm sure that fidgeting was part of a trauma response to certain things, but nobody recognizes it. You just stop fidgeting. And it wasn't like...
It's a tick, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just, I kind of... And I suppose if I was to trace it back, I was young, but if I was nervous, if I was anxious, if I felt like, I might be...
We all stim, we all have little ticks.
Is this stim a contraction of stimulation? Is that what it's coming from?
I don't know, if
But
I'm really honest.
stimming
but
is...
it's certainly with Leo, he's needing to move. He's needing to do something with his hands. He needs to jump a lot. And that can go right up into adulthood. Although as you grow older, a lot of individuals actually learn to mask that, and to try and stop doing something that you need to do is really, really difficult. Another thing I know that schools allow more, especially in SEN schools, is the chewing of gum, because they're getting sensory input and they're moving. There's nothing more that Leo loves right now than being pushed around in a trolley when we go to Sainsbury's whilst eating a whole raw cauliflower. Now, we get a lot of looks and comments, as you can imagine, because he eats the whole thing. I mean, the leaves, the stem, the whole thing. But what he's doing is he's regulating himself in what is a very challenging environment for him.
Because there's so much going on,
There's so much noise, there's people all around. But he needs that cauliflower in that moment to get round that shop. So, yeah, it's not normal, socially acceptable behaviour perhaps. But so I think being flexible to those needs is really important. And that can translate into the community, but the world of work. Another example of, being flexible to different individuals' needs comes from a time when we took Leo, we attempted to take him abroad on an aeroplane when he was a toddler.
I can't even imagine how that played out.
We went to Portugal, and, you can imagine that the journey was fraught. It was lots of queuing, stopping, starting, everything that Leo really struggles with. But what comes to mind actually is the captain of the airline on the way out was really accommodating and understanding. And we tell them all in advance. But the captain of the airline on the way back wasn't. He actually made us physically restrain Leo in the seat next to us for the whole takeoff and the whole landing, which was 40 minutes up and 40 minutes down, with him biting, screaming, kicking. It was incredibly traumatic for us, for Leo, and for, quite frankly, the passengers around us. And it's a long time to keep someone still in their seat. All Leo wanted to do was to sit on our lap. And the captain on the way out allowed that, and just to use one of the extender belts that you use for children that are under 2. Leo was only just over 2, by the way, at that point. So it was such an easy fix that would have made all the difference in that moment. But there was no bending of the rules at that point, because that was the process. But I think that's an example of an airline, an employer, not really listening and understanding, not being empathetic to what could have made such a huge difference at that point, right?
It's I cannot begin to tell you what a brilliant example that is. So, because I was going to say to you, so what's the difference in your mind between the two airline pilots?
I think they both had the awareness, because they were both told.
So they're both aware.
Both aware. One had empathy, the other did not. One was flexible, the other was not. It's as simple as that.
And it's a nice illustration for me of perhaps at the extremes, the difference between leadership and management. Because I think the distinction is quite simple, that the manager is concerned with doing things right, whereas the leader is concerned with doing the right thing.
I couldn't agree more.
And the distinction is played out so beautifully in this example. But the thing that struck me about that story when you told it the first time round, it just took me back to where we began our conversation. And I was thinking to myself, maybe this is the whole thing, that for you to have the level of understanding and empathy, the reason you have that is because you love Leo, right? You and your husband and your daughter love your son, her sibling. And that love begets a number of things. Love is free of judgment. Love is only accepting. And love understands. And I think, in a very serious way, I think that we've forgotten that in the workplace, because we really don't need people that love leadership. We need loving leaders. We need people that genuinely care about the people they're leading. And for me, this is a real tension point within the inclusion conversation, because I think that we've done something radically wrong. When I first went to work, we used to go to the personnel department. And if you went to see personnel, you could expect a cup of tea, maybe some biscuits. It was a nice place to go. Today, if you get a call from HR, that's not good news, right? HR call you, that's not going to be good. And part of the reason for that is it seems that HR, and this is a slight parody, of course, I think the notion is we're thinking about humans as being resources, and they sit on our expense column and our balance sheet, and they're just resources. And when we're trying to look at our business, if we've got spending too much money, we look at what are we spending on resources. So they're just numbers on a spreadsheet. And what I think this story about the airline pilots tell me is there's a difference between thinking about humans as resources and thinking about how can we resource humans.
That's a lovely, lovely way of putting it.
That's what we're trying to do, right? If we can resource humans, and we can resource Leo, and we can resource you, and we can resource me, then I think we just get better outcomes, right? Because
we do. In that instance,
everybody
we would
wins.
have had a nice holiday.
You have a nice holiday. All the other passengers on the flight have a nice flight.
Yeah.
Leo has it fun. What's the problem?
Yeah.
What's the problem?
Yeah, eating a cauliflower round the shop is not bringing anyone any harm.
I've got no problem with that. And for the record, they pay for the cauliflower.
We're actually thinking of giving Leo a cauliflower for his birthday wrapped
Amazing.
up, because he'd much prefer that to any other
Isn't
present.
that brilliant? Let me ask you one final question. You've been just a joy to talk to, Nat, by the way, so thank you again. Let me ask you one final question. A word of advice or counsel or comfort or wisdom
Yes.
for parents, because obviously you're journeying this, as 1 in 5 parents will also be on this sort of a journey at one level or another, but to your statistical point. 8 years in, what advice would you give?
As you said, Leo's journey and our experience will be unique, but I'm sure some of the things I've said will resonate with parents with neurodivergent children. But I would say, if your child's young, make sure that you get referrals with the right health professionals early.
That's important.
Don't underestimate how long assessments and diagnosis can take. So Leo's diagnosis took just over 2 years, and that's a very typical waiting time for young children in England right now. Also, we were unprepared for the uphill battle that we would have to get Leo into a special school. It was actually making headlines on the news last night about the lack of spaces in special schools. There's a huge lack of funding as well. We had to really battle with our local authority. They wouldn't even assess Leo to begin with. So we actually had to appeal their decision, and we almost had to go to tribunal. Thankfully, we didn't get to that point, and he is now in a special school. But spaces are really hard to come by, and it's actually, like winning the lottery to get a space at an SEN school today. So many parents of children aren't actually in the education system because there's no setting that will meet their needs.
Yeah, there's no.
And Leo's wonderful school, in fact, can't afford to be open 5 days a week. So that's really tricky for any working parent. So advice is to start things off as early as you can when it comes to schooling and assessments and diagnosis.
Really, really good. Nat, thank you so much. I know that the people that are going to watch this are going to be absolutely indebted to you. Honestly, it's so gracious of you
Thank
just
you
to
so
come
much.
and share, and such wonderful stories. I sure next time I'm in the supermarket, I should look out for
Yes.
California cauliflower eating children running around the place. Listen, thank you so very much for joining us for the Human Inclusion Podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm hard to believe that you wouldn't have been moved by this wonderful conversation. And by all means, tell people, share their podcast, and reach out to Nat and to Esther at Stanton House. And I'm sure they'll be happy to help you, and also get a hold of their guide, because they've got a very, very interesting neurodiversity guide for employers. So you want to make sure you get hold of that as well. Thank you for being with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.